Kirston Blom. I reside from Treaty 4 territory. I live in Regina, Saskatchewan. I'm a band member of Inequities Cree Nation with strong Métis heritage ties to the Kleins and the Amiots. Why isn't this working? So this is who I strongly identify as. I'm a proud mother of 4 kids, Lincoln, Ophelia, Adeline, and August. They are Métis citizens with MNS. And as you can tell, I'm obviously a huge hockey mom as well. And I also put in here my cousin's 3 kids because they were also what inspired me and motivated me to speak more to about these issues. And that's Emma, Jackson, and Furious. And for a short time, they were living with me for about 2 years. So we need to shine a light on and bring awareness to the resilience and strength of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. While they face significant health and social disparities, including overrepresentation in the child welfare and justice systems, inadequate access to essential services, and systemic racism, their voices are rising in strength and unity. First Nations and Métis and Inuit people who have historically faced disproportionate violence and injustice are standing up and demanding their place in society. Their stories of survival and empowerment inspire a powerful movement towards justice and equality. With half of federally incarcerated women identifying as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, the call to reform is stronger than ever as communities strive to break the cycles of violence and poverty. Together, these voices are creating waves of change, shining a light on the path toward healing, unity, bringing brighter future for all. And the perseverance of Indigenous people serves as a sign of hope and a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resilience and strength may lead to transformative change. So the overall purpose of this presentation is to discuss what the literature says on how storytelling from First Nations and Métis people can be empowering for them and provide meaningful impact as to where Western society can partner and become stronger allies. The stories of criminalized First Nations and Métis women in urban Saskatchewan via a westernized approach to a literature review provides an example of how organizations can come together. And it serves an opportunity to elevate the voices of these women and shines a light on their unique narratives and invaluable life experiences before, during, and after incarceration. And by exploring these stories, we can gain profound insights into the challenges that they have gone through. Oh, so the Indian Act. I do have to start off with this controversial piece of act because at the very foundation and core, this is where a lot of issues have started for First Nations women, especially, and also a part of Métis women as well. So in 1951, the Indian Act contained several unjust rules that specifically targeted the rights of First Nations women, such as the double mother rule and the marry out rule. And for my personal experience, this did impact my family because my great-grandmother, Emma Deminy, married a non-Indigenous man who is actually Métis, but because she chose to marry him, she was removed from the reserve and she lost her status, and that did impact her children going forward and then those children's children. And these regulations not only stripped women of their status, but also perpetuate cycles of discrimination within their communities. And in 1985, inspired by the determination fueled by the principles of equality, enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, legal reforms began to dismantle this discriminatory aspect of the Act. So Bill C-31 was a significant victory that removed many of the gender-based disparities in registration for status. However, that's still ongoing. While significant strides have been made, discussions surrounding the second generation cutoff reminds us that the struggle for full rights and recognition still continues. And when I say about that, the second generation cutoff, for those who don't know about the Bill C-31 with the Indian Act, it means that throughout the person who is status, if they chose to marry a non-status person, that child could be considered like 50% status. And if that child had another child with someone who was non-status, then that child would not have any status whatsoever. So that's what they mean by the second generation cutoff. And this is really impactful and very controversial for a lot of First Nations people still, because when you look at it, it's from their perspective, this is just the government's way of still getting rid of the Indian and therefore getting rid of the treaty. Therefore, they are no longer responsible for First Nations people. So the Indian Act, while controversial and criticized by many as a form of something that is not what we want, it also represents a pivotal chapter in the ongoing journey towards self-determination for Indigenous peoples and reminds us of a historical context from which contemporary movements emerge. So here I do share a quote that was said by someone when they spoke about the Indian Act. We do not want the Indian Act retained because it's a good piece of legislation. It isn't. It is discriminatory from start to finish, but it is a lever in our hands and an embarrassment to the government, as it should be. And not just society, and not society with even pretensions to being just can long tolerate for such a piece of legislation, but we would rather continue to live in bondage under the unequitable Indian Act than surrender our sacred rights. Anytime the government wants to honor its obligations to us, we are more than happy to help devise new Indian legislation. And before I go more into these women's stories about their experiences with criminalized activities and like what they consider successful reintegration, we do need to understand from an Indigenous perspective what mental wellness looks like and what the difference is between mental health and mental wellness. So the difference between mental health and mental wellness lies in their scope and emphasis. Mental health refers to an individual's emotional, psychological, and social well-being, is associated with the presence or absence of mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia. Mental health is commonly framed in a medical and psychological term, focusing on diagnosis, treatment, and clinical interventions. And in contrast, mental wellness is a holistic concept that emphasizes balance, resilience, and overall well-being, rather than just the absence of illness. It includes emotional, spiritual, physical, and relational aspects of life. Mental wellness often incorporates cultural and community-based approaches such as traditional healing, connection to the land, and a sense of purpose. And by switching from the term mental health to mental wellness, it's important because it shifts the focus from illness and pathology to holistic well-being, resilience, and balance. This shift is especially significant in First Nation and Métis and Inuit perspectives, where land is understood as an interconnected relationship between the mind, body, spirit, community, and land. And this is something else I do need to address when we are speaking about these stories, is the differences between Indigenous versus First Nations versus Métis versus Inuit. And right now we're kind of living more in a society where we just condense them all into one term, and that's Indigenous. But we do also need to understand and reflect the different culture and practices and traditions that each of these groups have. First Nations, with their deep-rooted connections to the land, showcase a vibrant range of cultural practices, such as powwows, sweat lodges, and those type of ceremonies, whereas Métis bring forth a beautiful union of First Nations and European heritages, expressing their identity through art, music, and community governance. And the Inuit people, resilient in the face of extreme Arctic conditions, demonstrate incredible adaptability, strength through their traditional practices and survival skills. And I just have to do a quick shout out there to the middle photo there of a woman jigging. That's my cousin Courtney Adequad. So when we look at the Métis perspective and principles on Métis health, well-being, and mental wellness, the Métis people, a vibrant and resilient group, embody a remarkable legacy as one of the 3 recognized Indigenous nations in Canada. Their roots stretch back to the early unions between First Nations women and European fur traders in the 17th century. And that's a testament to the strength and adaptability of cultures coming together, even under complex circumstances, because while these unions were often born out of necessity, they also sow the seeds of a distinct identity that's flourished through generations. And I would like also to point out that they weren't officially recognized until about 1982. The Métis Nation's journey toward acknowledgement and equality has been marked by challenges. Historically sidelined by governmental policies, the Métis have faced significant social, political, and economic inequalities, yet despite these hurdles, they have maintained a fierce spirit that is evident in their ongoing struggle for recognition and equitable healthcare. So unlike First Nations, who benefited at least from treaty agreements, the Métis have had to carve out their own path and relying on the resilience and community strength. So with Métis health and well-being, this is shaped by both traditional knowledge and Western influences. Métis people historically combined Indigenous healing practices with European medical knowledge, leading to a unique approach to healthcare. Well-being is understood as more than just the absence of disease. It includes family connections, self-sufficiency, and resilience. So Métis wellness, mental wellness is viewed holistically, meaning that mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual health are interconnected, and key aspects of mental wellness include community kinship, cultural identity, traditional knowledge and practices, spirituality, and intergenerational resilience. And with Métis health is commonly understood as being holistic, where spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical health are interconnected, with each component requiring attention and balance. This has a commonly cited both throughout the interviews within the support of Métis health literature. Yet, given the biomedical model only focusing on one dimension, such as physical health, the healthcare system doesn't adequately address Métis health needs. And some of the key principles of Métis health is the holistic wellness, the community kinship, cultural identity and pride, land-based connection, spirituality and healing, resilience, adaptability, intergenerational knowledge sharing, self-determination and empowerment, recognition of colonial impacts, cultural safety, and inclusive care. And these principles shape Métis approaches to health and wellness, and it emphasizes balance of cultural connection, resilience, and community support as pathways to healing. And for those who don't know much about what determinants of health means, the concept of determinants of health is especially embraced by many Métis researchers and aligns closely with traditional Métis views on health. So the determinants of health perspective emphasizes that health encompasses much more than just physical well-being. It is significantly impacted by social, political, and economic factors, and these determinants are often regarded as the causes of causes. So in this story that I provided in this presentation, we follow a young Métis girl named Lisa who ends up in the hospital after fainting at school. The cause of her fainting is connected to multiple factors that are influenced by her environment and her family situation. So Lisa was exhausted and hungry because of a long bus ride, a lack of food at home, and financial struggles. Her family doesn't have enough money because her father lost her job, which is hard to replace due to limited opportunities in northern British Columbia. The reasons why Lisa's family lives in that community is because it's their traditional territory, where they practice Métis cultural activities like hunting, trapping, gathering medicine, and speaking their language. However, economic changes such as resource boom in this area led to environmental damage and pollution. This impacted their ability to hunt and gather food in the way they traditionally did. The community's lack of control over development meant that they couldn't stop the damage. So at a deeper level, this story highlights the systemic issues Métis communities face, including being overlooked in decisions about their land and resources, which contributes to their economic hardship and food insecurity. This situation shows how broader determinants of health, like access to food, employment, and a safe environment, are interconnected and deeply impacted by the loss of control over their lands and traditions. So when it comes to First Nations Métis perspectives on health, it offers an inspiring model of integration. They advocate for a beautiful balance among the spirit, the heart, mind, and body. And this rich, holistic approach reminds us that we are more than just our individual parts. We are interconnected beings, and our wellness is deeply intertwined with the world around us. So for here, I brought the model from the First Nations Health Authority when it comes to wellness. At the heart of this, the center symbolizes the individual. Each one of us is responsible for our own health and wellness. Whether we are First Nations or not, the journey begins within. And moving forward, the second circle emphasizes the vital interplay among the emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical aspects of life. Nurturing these elements together fosters a robust state of well-being where each area supports and strengthens the other. Supporting these circles, the third circle embodies the foundational values that uplift our wellness journey, which is respect, wisdom, responsibility, and relationships. Respect teaches us to honor our roots, our culture, our traditions, and ourselves. Is more than appreciation. It's a profound acknowledgement of community and intergenerational wisdom that enriches our lives and strengthens our relationships. Wisdom passed down through generations is a sacred knowledge encompassing language, traditions, and the healing medicine of our ancestors. It gives us in navigating life with insight and understanding. Responsibility calls us to care for others, our families, our communities. This divine duty compels us toward accountability and engagement, urging us to set an example of wellness and to lead with heart. And finally, the relationships are our lifeblood, crucial to our existence. They remind us that we are not alone. We thrive together through nurturing connections based on trust, love, and shared experiences. And the fourth circle expands our horizon, reminding us to honor the people and places that shape our lives, that is, land, community, family, and nations. We are not just elements in our environment. We are intrinsic to our health and identity. Together, these perspectives weave a tapestry of wellness that inspire us to embrace our journey, fostering balance and connection in a world that yearns for healing and unity. And then people make up the outer circle, represent the vision of strong children, families, elders, and people and communities. The people are holding hands to demonstrate togetherness, respect, and relationships, which is, in the words of a respected BC elder, can be stated as one heart, one mind. Children are included in the drawing because they are at the heart of our communities and they connect us to who we are in our health. So as Elder Jim Dumont emphasized that mental wellness requires balance in the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of life, he highlighted the importance of fostering connections at the individual, family, and community levels to achieve this balance. So personal responsibility serves as an apparent cornerstone in the journey of healing. This notion ignites a spark within us, encouraging us to embrace ownership of our healing journeys. It reminds us that even the smallest steps can lead to the monumental transformations. And at the heart of this journey lies the concept. I can't pronounce that because I do not speak Cree, unfortunately. I'm still learning. It emphasizes the importance of nurturing ourselves through education and personal growth. So equally essential are the relationships we cultivate. Positive connections with family, friends, and mentors form a robust support systems that nurtures our emotional well-being. These bonds foster self-awareness, instill hope, and often becoming the bedrock for personal growth and resilience. So the essence of worldview serves as a powerful foundation for mental wellness, and it emphasizes personal responsibility in a positive mindset, embracing gratitude, practicing positive thinking, and savoring each day to uplift our spirits and enhance our mental wellness. These invaluable practices, often rooted in family teachings, instill resilience and perseverance, and it guides us through life challenges. Traditional wellness approaches beautifully advocate for harmony among our spirit, heart, mind, and body. So when it comes to the First Nations determinants of health, it's very close to the Métis one that I presented earlier, but because of the different cultures and because of both of them having experienced colonialism and racism and discrimination, their approach to determinants of health both are different, but at the same time, they do have that intersection of being the same. And in First Nations communities, acknowledging the profound impact of history, economics, and social structures is essential. The challenges faced, such as housing shortages and food insecurity, are part of a larger story that calls for hope and resilience. So when we look at the role of land in Indigenous mental wellness, in the heart of Canada, First Nations and Métis Inuit groups share a profound and sacred bond with the land, a bond that nurtures their identity and fuels their spirit and engages in traditional practices on the land, fosters a deep sense of family, culture, and place, an unspoken but potent source of healing. And as a passionate advocate for Indigenous mental wellness express, when people feel well is when they're out on the land. When we immerse ourselves in nature, we are enveloped by a web of connection and tranquility. Places like Willows Lake become more than a beautiful landscape. They transform into sacred grounds where peace, harmony, and healing intertwine with daily life. So now that I've given kind of a rundown to I just wish I had more time to speak on the things I spoke about, but that's a simplified version of it. So when we look at disparities in the criminal justice system, reintegration can be challenging for many offenders, but it's important to highlight the resilience and strength that individuals, particularly First Nations and Métis women, can exhibit in the face of adversity. While the journey back into society can be fraught with obstacles such as stigma, access to crucial services, and unstable living conditions, every step taken towards overcoming these barriers is a testament to determination and hope. So as we reflect on the past and the systemic issues within the criminal justice system, it's crucial to recognize the growing movements for social and racial equity. These voices are not just echoing cries for justice, they are calls to action that inspire change. And by measuring and addressing inequalities, they can pave the way for a stronger and more inclusive society. So understanding the impact of colonialism reveals not just loss, but the potential for healing and restoration. And before colonialism, First Nations and Métis women were revered leaders and vital contributors to their societies. Today, the journey towards reclaiming that respect and restoring their rightful roles is essential for building stronger and more equitable communities. And we need to amplify the voices of First Nations and Métis women and encourage a dialogue that honors their experiences and contributions. So healing is possible, and the community support and acknowledgement of their histories, these women can reclaim their narratives and inspire future generations. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the statistics side of things because, as we all know, and from what I hear from so many First Nations and Métis researchers, is that they are researched to death. There is so much that can be spoken about with this population, but a lot of it's like a deficit base and nothing about like what they consider a strength to overcome these situations. But as we can see in Saskatchewan, we're overrepresented. Like we're at the highest when it comes to overrepresentation with Indigenous people being incarcerated, whether that be from a provincial or federal standpoint. And women are more higher at being overrepresented and reoffending when it comes to Saskatchewan. And that's even to this date. So there is something that's not working, and there are issues going on that we need to start talking about and discussing about what's going on. Why is Saskatchewan at this? And even when it comes to victimization status, First Nations and Métis women are at the highest rate with reporting experience of violence and experiencing physical assault by non-intimate partners and intimate partners. So with the first, I've looked into 3 theses that specifically spoke about, one was being this one, the systemic factors leading to miscarriages of justice for Indigenous women. And this one involved interviewing 12 women in Canada. It didn't specify specifically the prairies, and it didn't specify if they were First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. It was Indigenous, but they gave 12 stories and narratives of these women about how the justice system failed them. And there were common themes within that report as to like how the system failed them. So Margaret Jacobs shows how the colonial mindset behind residential school still exists in welfare and in prisons. Indigenous children continue to be taken from their family under the guise of rescue, echoing past policies that tore communities apart. These systems rooted in outdated ideologies punish Indigenous people instead of supporting them. And Indigenous women face the harshest impacts of colonial violence. And the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry exposes how colonialism fuels their over-incarceration and often punishing them for surviving systemic neglect. Police negligence and institutional failure worsens these injustices, reinforcing the victim blaming instead of protection. And generations of trauma have created cycles of harm, forced separations, and institutionalization. Many who were treated as prisoners in residential schools later ended in actual prisons, and Canada continues to incarcerate Indigenous women and girls, not because of individual failures, but as a direct result of colonization and its lasting impacts. So violence against Indigenous women in this report had long been ignored or dismissed by authorities, and these women are left unprotected. Police often fail to investigate, did not believe victims, and in some cases were perpetrators themselves. This sent a devastating message that Indigenous women were left to protect themselves and their children alone. So when it comes to the bias of the criminal justice system, women who use lethal force to defend themselves from abuse risk mandatory life sentences if charged with first-degree murder, facing at least 25 years before parole eligibility. And this threat is often a leverage for Crown prosecutors, pressuring women, especially Indigenous women, into pleading guilty to lesser charges, even when they had valid self-defense claim. Most pleaded guilty to manslaughter or second-degree murder rather than risk a trial and life sentence, and prosecutors frequently offered plea deals with lighter sentences, and defense lawyers, fearing harsher penalties, often advised guilty pleas even when evidence supported self-defense. Indigenous and marginalized women are disproportionately affected by this, as many lack financial resources for a strong defense, and those women, often with children, often avoid trials to protect them from a trauma of testifying. And I say that because a lot of times when women act in self-defense, sometimes the only witnesses are the children themselves. And instead of putting those children through trial, they chose to take the deal that was given by the Crown prosecutor just to save their children from that kind of trauma. So the justice system's failure to recognize the long-term impact of abuse and the realities of self-defense perpetuates injustice. And Indigenous women continue to be criminalized for actions that stem directly from their need to survive violence and systemic marginalization. And there's a concept called hyper-responsibilization, which is shaped by deeply entrenched racist and sexist biases. It results in Indigenous women being held more accountable than others, even when they are the victims of violence. This pattern can be traced back to residential schools where the children were taught that they were sinful, savage, and dangerous. These stereotypes persist today in the media, legal policies, and social attitudes, fueling a system that often assumes Indigenous women are more culpable than their male abusers. Many internalize this narrative because they are at fault, even when they have a valid legal defense. And in the case of one called Helen Naslund, this is exemplified as these biases led to grave injustices. So after nearly 30 years of relentless physical and psychological and sexual abuse, Helen Naslund killed her husband in an act of self-preservation. Yet instead of recognizing her suffering, the trial judge portrayed her abuser as vulnerable and implied that her failure to leave that relationship meant that violence was not severe. This ignorance overwhelming evidence show that leaving an abusive partner often escalates the risk of homicide, and her case is not unique because many Indigenous women are criminalized for actions when they bear little or no legal responsibility, and it reinforces a cycle of victimization and injustice. And their encounters with police are frequently traumatic, particularly for those who have experienced the lasting effects of colonial violence, such as residential schools and forced assimilation. From a young age, many Indigenous women are exposed to abuse by authority figures, and it could also be the police that do that when they are vulnerable and in need of help. And instead of receiving support, they are often subjected to force and mistreatment. When they defend themselves, they are rarely offered alternatives to criminalization and are instead charged, and this further compounds their trauma. So with this one, it speaks more to Section 718.2E of the Criminal Code, which requires that Indigenous history be considered in sentencing, but mandatory minimum penalties prevent judges from applying this provision. And this leads to harsher sentences for Indigenous women, particularly in Saskatchewan. So in cases like murder, where Indigenous context should be considered, this is often overlooked, and lawyers frequently fail to recognize the violence and racism Indigenous women face, neglecting to raise this during trials or plea discussions. And many Indigenous women are criminalized for offenses related to abuse, coercion, or poverty. And the failure to apply this section contributes to the misrepresentation of these women's victimization, with abused women wrongly seen as aggressors. And this prevents women from sharing their trauma and reinforces feelings of guilt for defending themselves. And then finally, many of these women are incarcerated due to crimes linked to survival in the face of violence, poverty, or systemic marginalization. The criminal justice system's failure to explore alternatives to prison exacerbates their unmet mental health, trauma, and healthcare needs for these women. While some prisons may offer culturally adapted services such as Indigenous teachings or access to elders, these efforts are often insufficient in addressing the root causes of health disparities faced by incarcerated women. So the emphasis on imprisonment instead of community-based alternatives leaves many women without the support that they need to heal from trauma. And in this one other thesis one that was done, this was done in Regina, and it was on the life experiences, so before, during, and after incarceration. And through these interviews that were done in Regina, and what the common theme was these four things: family reunification and child advocacy, increased stigma, barriers to medical, mental health, and addiction services, and difficulty overcoming past trauma. These were the key themes that the researcher took out of these women's experiences when it came to failures of successful reintegration. So with family reunification and child advocacy, for many of these women, motherhood is central to their identity, making family reunification a crucial yet often overlooked aspect of their reintegration journey. Women offenders are more likely to have been the primary caregivers for their children before their conviction, and many of their offenses stem from struggles to secure basic necessities for their families. However, barriers such as custody disputes, a lack of child advocacy support, and societal stigma make rebuilding these relationships profoundly challenging. And like, as moms that are all on here, the emotional toll of separation is immense. So the pain of being apart from their children weighs heavily on these women and intensifies the distress of reintegration. And research has shown that strong family bonds and parental commitment can significantly contribute to successful reintegration. Yet women receive little to no assistance in navigating custody issues or restoring relationships or developing effective parenting strategies. And one story in here exemplifies these struggles. Like many formerly incarcerated mothers, she faced immense obstacles in assuming her parental role because this transition was not only emotionally overwhelming, but also compounded by the lack of structural support available to help her rebuild trust and stability within her family. Her experiences highlights a broader systemic failure to recognize and address the unique reintegration needs of women offenders, particularly those striving to reconnect with their children. And with increased stigma, women offenders are often subjected to harsher societal judgment and stigmatization, which can exacerbate feelings of isolation and hinder their ability to reintegrate into their communities effectively. So the dual stigma, being both a woman and offender, creates an additional barrier to acceptance and opportunity. Moreover, female offenders may experience increased stigma because of their criminal records, and this adds to the risk to reoffend. And past research demonstrates that women face exaggerated issues associated with their charges. So because crime is viewed as a male-dominated activity, females who commit crime are often viewed as doubly deviant for disobeying social norms and as well as traditional gender roles. And this can be emphasized for women incarcerated for drug abuse and women with children who are then considered bad mothers. And with barriers to medical, mental health, and addiction services, substance use treatment to be truly effective, support must extend beyond incarceration. So women offenders often face challenges including co-occurring mental health disorders, chronic medical conditions, and histories of trauma. Without access to specialized treatment post-release, the likelihood of relapse and reoffending increases, yet systemic barriers such as shortage of community-based treatment programs, service refusal, lack of transportation, childcare, and programs that fail to address women's unique needs severely limit their opportunities for recovery. And according to previous research, experiences of childhood abuse are common among women who come into contact with the criminal justice system. These experiences can be extremely traumatic and yet often begin during childhood and persist into adulthood via romantic relationships. So the theme was evident throughout the stories shared by these participants. More specifically, the women identified various instances of physical, verbal, spiritual, and/or sexual abuse, neglect, and living with alcoholic parents or partners. And this is the last thesis that I looked into for this, and it's the perspectives of what these women considered was successful for them, or what post-release success is for them. So the study spoke about how in prison literature There's an absence of narratives highlighting Indigenous women's unique experiences and perspectives on what successful transitions from federal and provincial institutions entail. Understanding these experiences is vital as they provide critical insight into the resilience and the strengths they possess while navigating the complexities of the system. So the lack of representation in existing narratives represents an opportunity to shift our understanding of success in the context of Indigenous women. Research indicates that culturally based prison programs can offer significant support to Indigenous women. However, there is transitional challenges, particularly when moving from prisons to urban communities in Saskatchewan. While these women engage meaningfully with Indigenous culture and traditions during incarceration, there is challenges accessing these resources post-release, and it can be transformed into avenues for advocacy and support. So we need to have the conversation. We have the conversation. We have the literature that says the system's not working. But why is there no changes when it comes to these overrepresentations? So many women's experiences are often overlooked due to privileges held by experts operating within white, heteronormative, and patriarchal frameworks. This narrative approach allows them to share their stories without the stigma imposed by society that frequently labels them negatively. Furthermore, there's a need to challenge the deficit-based narratives that frame criminalized individuals in a negative light. In the context of prison rehabilitation programs, cultural reclamation projects have emerged as essential initiatives aimed at supporting incarcerated Indigenous individuals as they reintegrate into society. While prison officials commonly assert that they lack control over who enters the prison system, it is crucial to recognize that their policies significantly affect the transition from incarceration to community life. For instance, one woman who participated in this study expressed her frustrations with the obstacles perpetuated by the system, saying, "It's like they work against you. It's like they take pride in breaking your spirit." So efforts to reform the criminal justice system for Indigenous women focus on recognizing their cultural identity, but often fail to address the systemic issues causing their over-incarceration. So in this one quote that talks about the GLADU, I even have like opinions about the GLADU report. I think it's good. I think it's really good to bring awareness to what they went through. But the way they go about it and their approach to it, I don't agree with, because when the lawyer speaks about a GLADU report in court, you're pretty much just saying all the deficits and the trauma of that person. So they'll have that person there and they'll speak about the GLADU report, speak about the trauma in front of everyone in court, in front of the judge. And to me, that just is really humiliating, dehumanizing them. And for me, if I had my trauma exposed to the whole courtroom for strangers I don't know hearing about it, that would make me feel like guilty and shame. And that's what I have an opinion about the GLADU report. And a lot of these women perceive prisons as another type of reserve from this study. And culturally grounded programs in prisons offer healing and connection to heritage, but once they leave the institution, there's nothing there for them. And I provided a photo of this because this was in a report for correctional investigator. It was in a 2015-2016 report by Howard Sappers, and he referred to a Prairie Province prison as an Indigenous prison. And the photo here I provide is an image of a teepee and ceremonial sweat lodge enclosed by barbed wire. And this stark paradox highlights the Canadian government's contradiction. While committing to reconciliation and promising to eliminate Indigenous over-incarceration, it continues to uphold a carceral system rooted in colonial control. So despite federal investment in cultural programming, these prisons remain disconnected from the realities of Indigenous women's lives. So the current focus on indigenizing prison does not address the root causes of Indigenous women's incarceration. Simply adding ceremonies to carceral spaces legitimizes ongoing colonial control rather than dismantling the system that criminalized Indigenous women in the first place. So true justice requires shifting resources away from prisons and toward community-led solutions, one that prioritizes self-determination and address socioeconomic inequities. And the transition from prison to community reveals a stark gap between the rhetoric of rehabilitation and the lived realities of Indigenous women seeking cultural connection. One described the disappointment she faced upon release, saying, I would show up to certain sweat lodges, and because I couldn't speak Cree, I wasn't allowed in. I had to learn things the hard way. So her words highlight the complexity of reintegration, where prison programs create expectations of cultural accessibility that are often unmet in urban and reserved communities. And this can also speak volumes to the fact that as much as intentions may be good, it is just becoming more pan-Indigenous. And another woman reflected on the abrupt loss of cultural support after release. While in prison, we had all the elders around, and then we would have our sharing circle. And then when you get out, it is not there. She emphasized the division between urban and reserve-based programs, explaining every time they have a program is just for the people living on the reserve. They separate us. These experiences expose the ongoing effects of colonialism, where state control over Indigenous identity extends beyond prison walls and influences access to culture, healing, and community belonging. And one survivor noted that striking parallels between the discipline imposed by nuns in residential schools and the punitive measures she later experienced in prison, remarking that her time in school had unknowingly prepared her for incarceration. This reflects a broader reality that many survivors of Indian residential schools system describe these institutions as prisons for children. Like residential schools, prisons suppress Indigenous identity under the guise of rehabilitation. Residential school punish children for speaking their languages and practicing their culture, while prison-mandated healing programs often penalize Indigenous women for not conforming to settler-defined healing plans. So these programs, rather than fostering true healing, can function as tools of social control within carceral systems. And the women in this study define conventional notions of success, emphasizing personal metrics such as living free from violence, avoiding criminal justice scrutiny, and overcoming the social stigma linked to their past. They express that societal expectations focused on material possessions like owning a car or having a job do not represent their lived experiences. As one participant noted, the societal emphasis on material success can lead to feelings of inadequacy for existing incarceration. So the testimonies of these women reveal a deep understanding of what is needed to address the complexities they face after being released from prison. Their insights also underscore recurring issue, the lack of effective community support. This is not a new concern that reinforces previous research indicating that the community often fails to deliver the support it claims to provide for formerly incarcerated women. Each woman interviewed for this study had sent back to prison at least once, leading to their classification within the system as reoffenders or individuals unable to successfully reintegrate into society. Yet one woman challenges the narrative. She questioned how the system criminalizes behaviors such as alcohol consumption that are legal in settler colonial Canada, exposing how systemic structures disproportionately penalize Indigenous women. Additionally, the system and cognitive behavioral researchers often frame substance use as a barrier to resilience. However, resilience, particularly within Indigenous and other oppressed communities, is a nuanced concept. It is celebrated for, while it is celebrated for fostering hope in adversity, resilience literature often focuses on traits associated with positive psychology and high social desirability. One woman pointed out that this perspective overlooks an essential aspect of resilience, rebellion. Her critique highlights the need to expand resilience framework to ensure acts of resistance and defiance also can be seen as form of survival and agency. So one literature examined criminalized women's perspectives to advance a comprehensive understanding of self-harm, and their study revealed that behaviors that have often been associated with rebellion, criminality, and destructiveness were perceived by criminalized women as coping mechanisms which helped them survive the system and survive the violence, emotional pain, and oppressive conditions in their life. Substance use as a coping mechanism is not uncommon for criminalized Indigenous women, and one woman disclosed how when she and others she knew were stigmatized from the public because of their criminalized statuses, they would get frustrated. Then they'll go back and use. And when I'm going back to prison because they were using substances. So there's an ongoing cycle with that. And the transition from prison to community is an overwhelming experience. And the women within the study consistently reveal that they negotiated their transitions with limited social, economic, and cultural supports. And when they were unable to conform to the expectations of their parole officers, they were categorized as unsuccessful. So the women who participated in this research defined success on their own terms. They refused to measure their post-release achievements as the ability to stay out of prison and instead create definitions rooted in personal empowerment, liberation from stigma, and reclaiming their identities. One woman's definition of success meant living free from the societal labels imposed upon her as a criminalized Indigenous woman in an urban center, breaking free from the weight of stigma, and another declared herself success, rejecting the narratives that sought to diminish her. So from what we can understand, what works is these women spoke highly about they want to be set up appropriately in the community. They do agree that programs within the correctional system does work, but they are not set up appropriately upon post-release. They're left to just kind of defend on their own when they're released, and they're just supposed to follow conditions, or they're not set up with appropriate supports. They don't have that mental health and addiction support post-release. They don't have that cultural aspect to go with post-release, and they don't have the proper supports when it comes to childcare and parenting. And this is coming from one woman who questions why, and there's one woman who questioned why there is no partnership happening among agencies. Why is everyone so concerned about the other organization taking responsibility instead of trying to work together? And she also pointed out that the toxic power dynamics within organizations and stressed the importance of having healthy program facilitators. She criticized prison programs for labeling Indigenous women as deficient and dysfunctional while overlooking the dysfunctions within the system itself. She emphasized that community work must be done by people who are well as they serve as role models for others. These women spoke about needing mental health and addiction support post-release, needing cultural connections from their communities, and wanting support from case management that can help them navigate the system and healthcare system for services. Most of the time, they are given common conditions with no clear direction as to how to navigate services. And one woman suggested workshops in healing lodges to share personal experiences of reintegration, emphasizing the power of storytelling. One spoke about stigmatized for having a criminal record. And as I relayed before, sometimes these women are charged with an offense for various reasons that we are not questioning, such as if a woman was charged with assault, why? Why is she unlawfully at large? Has she been exposed to so much violence that she feared for her safety, and so she was defending herself from an abusive partner? Was she on the run because she wanted to get back to her kids? So when I say unlawfully at large, there was one story within the study that she went to a halfway house, but she was so overwhelmed with anxiety and she just wanted to be with her kids. She was separated from them so unexpectedly that she wanted to be with her kids. So she left the halfway house and went looking for them. And she was considered unlawfully at large because of that. They want that mental health support given to them when they have where they can have a professional also with this other woman. The quote at the bottom spoke about this woman, how she wants that support. She wants that professional that they have built support with and trust with and has given them that safe space that if they are struggling with their mental wellness, then they have that safe support that they can turn to. And one woman advocated for incorporating cultural and practical supports at transitional housing facilities, suggesting that the presence of an Indigenous liaison to maintain connections to Indigenous ceremonies like sweats, round dances, and sharing circles. She also highlighted the importance of outreach workers who can assist with securing employment and housing, providing the foundation for reintegration. These ones' voices demand a radical rethinking of justice. They agree that the current focus on indigenized programs inside prisons shifts attention away from the broader realities of settler colonial violence and systemic inequities. These programs are administered by colonial institutions, fail to address the root causes of Indigenous women's criminalizations, instead advancing the goals of carceral control under the guise of cultural inclusion. So when it comes to health inequities, then when we're looking at successful reintegration, these women spoke about how there's limited availability of culturally safe and relevant health services. There's no way that they can navigate the community for mental health support in the criminal justice system post-release, whether that be from a provincial set point, whether that's through the court set point or federal set point, there's no help with navigating. And one thing I've wanted to note with all of these studies that I've done, none of it was Métis specific. They all just spoke about either Indigenous or it was just women in general. Nothing spoke specifically about First Nations and Métis, and that's why I think it's important to have these conversations because they all have mental health needs and services in their own way. So when we look at housing instability is a significant health inequity affecting formerly incarcerated women. Many women are released from prison without access to safe, stable, and affordable housing, and that often returning to the same precarious conditions that contributed to their criminal involvement. This lack of secure housing increases the risk of homelessness and exposure to violence, substance use, and mental health deterioration. Employment insecurity is a profound health inequity, and it contributes to the cycles of poverty, reoffending, and deteriorating mental and physical health. The stress of securing employment while meeting a correctional supervision requires, coupled with systemic discrimination and family responsibilities, it creates significant barriers to successful reintegration. The inability to balance these competing demands places Indigenous women at an increased risk of relapse, reoffending, and experiencing further social and economic marginalization. Limited access to education is a health inequity because it's a critical determinant of health. It influences access to stable employment, financial security, and overall well-being. However, many of these women in the system face systemic barriers to obtaining education, which limits their ability to rebuild their lives post-incarceration. And research indicates that committing to family roles such as parenting and successful reintegration can support that. However, the pressures of providing for children can also contribute to criminal activity among women. The impact of incarceration is particularly severe for mothers, as 55 to 70% of female offenders have children under the age of 18. Unlike incarcerated fathers, whose children are often placed with their mother, incarcerated women are more likely to have their children placed in foster care, leaving them without a parental presence. Additionally, female offenders have less contact with their children while incarcerated, leading to emotional distress and weakened family bonds. So, resilience is often seen as a process of overcoming adversity, adapting to change, or seizing opportunities as strength protective factors. In the forensic context, it refers to factors that help individuals avoid reoffending. For the participants in these stories, resilience manifests in self-actualization, independence, optimism, and perseverance. However, improvements are needed to better support criminalized women, particularly through mental health services, as female offenders often struggle with mental illness and abuse and addiction. While addiction services are offered, long wait lists and a lack of trauma-informed care hinder effective treatment. Incorporating trauma-informed approaches often help women address the root causes of these substances. And additionally, these women identified issues related to separation from their children, including the need for family reunification, child advocacy, and depression. And correctional institutions could better serve mothers by including these reunification and release planning and providing parental courses and supports. To further support women, more concrete release planning that could include courses, job training, or mentorship. Creative classes such as art or beading can also help reduce institutional conflict and keep women engaged. So historically, First Nations women, upon release, providing women and community supports for employment, housing, and mental health supports would aid in their reintegration, reducing the risk of reoffending. So I just want to end off with saying that these are the lovely people that have been my inspiration with and support throughout this whole process of trying to figure out my way with advocating for this population. My lovely people at CRS. And they have dealt a lot with me coming into their offices and going on a tangent about all these studies I'm looking into, and they've been so patient with me. My kids, obviously, and Emma Jackson Furious have always been my biggest inspirations too. And then finally, these are the people I'm doing it for. My great-grandfather, Joseph Amiot, my grandma Mary, my grandma Lucille, and my great-grandmother, Emma Denemy. I'm done.
You did it with 2 minutes to spare, Kirston. I will stop the recording now.